about the developments in AI for two reasons. My brother-in-law, Jim Keller, is a very well-known chip designer, and he's building a chip optimized for AI learning. And we've talked a fair bit about that. And I've talked to him on my YouTube channel about the perils and promises of AI, let's say. And I've been very fascinated by ChatGPT. I know I'm not alone in that. I've been using it most recently as a digital assistant, and I can ask it very complicated questions. Like I asked it the other day about, there's this old papyrus from Egypt, ancient Egypt, that details out a particular variant of the story of Horus and Osiris, two Egyptian gods. It's a very obscure piece of knowledge, and it has to do with the sexual element of a battle between two of the Egyptian gods. And I asked it about that and to find the appropriate citations and quotes from appropriate experts. And it did so very rapidly, but then it moralized at me about the sexual element of the story and told me that maybe it was in conflict with their community guidelines. And then I gave it hell. I told it to stop moralizing at me and that I just wanted academic answers. And it apologized and then seemed to do less of that, although it had to be reminded from time to time. So that's very weird that you can argue with it, let's say, and that it'll apologize. It also does quite frequently produce references that don't exist. Like about 85% of the time, 90% of the time, the references it provides are genuine. I always look them up and double check what it provides. But now and then it'll just invent something completely out of the blue and offer it as the actual article. And I don't understand that at all. It's like, especially because when you point it out, it again apologizes and then provides the accurate reference. It's like, so I don't understand how to account for the behavior of the system that's doing that. I was familiar to a limited degree with some of the statistical technologies that analyze, let's say, the relationship between words. So, for example, when psychologists derived the Big Five models of personality, they basically used very primitive AI stat systems, that's a way of thinking about it, to derive those models. It was factor analysis, which is, it's not using billions of parameters by any stretch of the imagination, but it was looking for words that were statistically likely to clump together. And the idea would be that words that were replaceable in sentences or words that were used in close conjunction with each other, especially adjectives, were likely to be assessing the same underlying construct or dimension. If you conducted the statistical analysis properly, which were very complex correlational analysis, you could find out how the words that people used to describe each other aggregated. And it turned out there were 5 dimensions of aggregation, approximately, and that's been a very robust finding. It seems to be true across different sets of languages. It seems to be true for phrases. It seems to be true for sentences. Now, with the large language models, which are AI learning driven, you said that the computer is calculating the statistical relationship between words, how likely a word is to occur in proximity to another word, but also letters. So it's conducting the analysis at the level of the letter and at the level of the words. Those systems are trained just to be accurate in their output. They're actually trained the same way we learn, as far as I can tell, is that they're given a target. I don't exactly know how that works with large language models, but I know that, for example, that AI systems that have learned to identify cats, which was an early accomplishment of AI systems, they were shown pictures of things that were cats and things that weren't cats, and basically just told when they got the identification right. And that set the weights that you're describing in all sorts of complex ways that are completely mysterious, and the end consequence of the reinforcement, same way that human beings learn, was that a system would assemble itself that somehow could identify cats and distinguish them from all the other things that were cat-like or not cat-like. And we have no idea. The system is too complex to model, and it's certainly too complex to reduce. Although my brother-in-law told me that some of these AI systems, they've managed to reduce what they do learn to something approximating an algorithm, but that can be done upon occasion, but generally isn't. Generally, the system can't be and isn't simplified. And so that would also imply to some degree that each AI system is unique. Right? Not only incomprehensible, but unique and incomprehensible. I think ChatGPT passes the Turing test, because I don't think that there was just a study released here the other day showing that if you get patients who are seeing doctors to interact with physicians or with ChatGPT, they actually prefer the interaction with ChatGPT to the interaction with the average doctor. So not only does ChatGPT apparently pass the Turing test, which is indistinguishability from a human conversational partner, but it seems to actually do it somewhat better, at least than physicians. What this brings up this thorny issue that, we're going to produce computational intelligences that are in many ways indistinguishable from human beings, but we're not going to understand them any better than we understand human beings. It's so funny, that we'll create this and we're going to create something we don't understand that works, which is a very strange thing. Apparently the AI system that Google relies on was asked a question in a language. I think it was a relatively obscure Bangladeshi language, and it couldn't answer the question. And now its goal is to answer questions. And so it went and taught itself this language, I believe, in a morning, and then it could answer in that language, which is what it's supposed to do because it's supposed to answer questions. And then it learned 1,000 languages. And that wasn't something it had been, say, told to do or programmed to do. Not that these systems are precisely programmed, but it also begs this very interesting question is that, well, we've designed these systems whose function, whose purpose, whose meaning, let's say, is to answer questions. But we don't really understand what it means to produce an artificial intelligence that's driven to do nothing but answer questions. We don't know exactly what answer a question means. Apparently it means learn a whole language before lunchtime, and no one exactly expected that. It might mean do anything that's within your power to answer this question. And that's also a rather terrifying proposition, because if I ask you a question, I'm certainly not going to presume that you would go hunt someone down and threaten them with death to extract the answer. Oh, that's one conceivable path you might take if you were as obsessed with nothing other than the necessity of answering the question. So that's another example of exactly, the fact that we don't understand exactly what sort of monsters we're building. So these systems do go on the language corpus to invent answers that seem plausible. And that's kind of a form of thought, right? It's a form of creative thought, because that's what we do when we come up with a creative idea. And, we might not attribute it to a false paper because we know better than to do that. But I don't see really the difference between hallucination in that case and actual creative thinking. It actually reacts quite a lot like a super intelligent child that's trying to please. Like it's a little more realistic. Maybe it's a super intelligent child raised by the woke equivalents of like evangelical preachers that's really trying hard to please. But it's so interesting that you can rein it in and discipline it and suggest to it that it doesn't err in the kind of directions that we described. It appears to actually pay attention to that and it certainly tries hard to deliver what you want, subject to whatever weird parameters, community guidelines and so forth that have been arbitrarily imposed upon it. Well, I've been thinking for many years about what it means for a human being to understand something. Now, obviously, there's something similar about what you and I are doing right now and what I'm doing with ChatGPT. I can have a conversation with ChatGPT and I can ask it questions and it'll answer them. But as you pointed out, that doesn't mean that ChatGPT understands. Now, it can mimic understanding to a degree that looks a lot like understanding, but what it seems to lack is something like grounding in the non-linguistic world. And so I would say that ChatGPT is the ultimate postmodernist, because the postmodernists believed that meaning was to be found only in the relationship between words. We know perfectly well from neuropsychological studies that human beings have at least 4 different kinds of memory, qualitatively different. There's short-term memory, which you already referred to. There's semantic memory, which is the kind of memory and cognitive processing, let's say, that ChatGPT engages in, and does it in a way that's quite a lot like what human beings do. But then we have episodic memory that seems to be more image-based. AI pioneers like Rodney Brooks suggested pretty early on, back in the 1990s, that computers wouldn't develop any understanding unless they were embodied, right? He was the inventor of the Roomba, and he invented apparently intelligent systems that had no semantic processing and didn't run on algorithms at all. They were embodied intelligences. So then you could imagine that for a computer to understand, it would have to have the capacity to translate words into images, and then images into alterations in actual embodied behavior. And so that would imply we wouldn't have AI systems that could understand until we have fully embodied robots. But, we're getting damn close to that, right? This is something we can also investigate. We have systems already that can transpose text into image. Apparently, the AI system that Google relies on was asked a question in a language. I think it was a relatively obscure Bangladeshi language. And it couldn't answer the question. And now its goal is to answer questions. And so it went and taught itself this language, I believe, in a morning. And then it could answer in that language, which is what it's supposed to do, because it's supposed to answer questions. And then it learned 1,000 languages. And that wasn't something it had been, say, told to do or programmed to do. Not that these systems are precisely programmed, but it also begs this very interesting question is that, well, we've designed these systems whose function, whose purpose, whose meaning, let's say, is to answer questions. But we don't really understand what it means to produce an artificial intelligence that's driven to do nothing but answer questions. We don't know exactly what answer a question means. Apparently it means learn a whole language before lunchtime, and no one exactly expected that. It might mean do anything that's within your power to answer this question. And that's also a rather terrifying proposition, because if I ask you a question, I'm certainly not going to presume that you would go hunt someone down and threaten them with death to extract the answer. That's one conceivable path you might take if you were as obsessed with nothing other than the necessity of answering the question. So that's another example of exactly, the fact that we don't understand exactly what sort of monsters we're building. So these systems do go on the language corpus to invent answers that seem plausible. And that's kind of a form of thought, right? It's a form of creative thought, because that's what we do when we come up with a creative idea. And, we might not attribute it to a false paper because we know better than to do that, but I don't see really the difference between hallucination in that case and actual creative thinking. It actually reacts quite a lot like a super intelligent child that's trying to please. Like, it's a little more realistic. Maybe it's a super intelligent child raised by the woke equivalents of like evangelical preachers that's really trying hard to please. But it's so interesting that you can rein it in and discipline it and suggest to it that it doesn't err in the kind of directions that we described. It will actually, it appears to actually pay attention to that and it certainly tries hard to deliver what you want, subject to whatever weird parameters, community guidelines and so forth that have been arbitrarily imposed upon it. Well, I've been thinking for many years about what it means for a human being to understand something. Now, obviously, there's something similar about what you and I are doing right now and what I'm doing with ChatGPT. I can have a conversation with ChatGPT and I can ask it questions and it'll answer them. But as you pointed out, that doesn't mean that ChatGPT understands. Now, it can mimic understanding to a degree that looks a lot like understanding, but what it seems to lack is something like grounding in the non-linguistic world. And so I would say that ChatGPT is the ultimate postmodernist, because the postmodernists believed that meaning was to be found only in the relationship between words. We know perfectly well from neuropsychological studies that human beings have at least 4 different kinds of memory, qualitatively different. There's short-term memory, which you already referred to. There's semantic memory, which is the kind of memory and cognitive processing, let's say, that ChatGPT engages in and does in a way that's quite a lot like what human beings do. But then we have episodic memory that seems to be more image-based. AI pioneers like Rodney Brooks suggested pretty early on, back in the 1990s, that computers wouldn't develop any understanding unless they were embodied, right? He was the inventor of the Roomba, and he invented apparently intelligent systems that had no semantic processing and didn't run on algorithms at all. They were embodied intelligences. So then you could imagine that for a computer to understand, it would have to have the capacity to translate words into images, and then images into alterations in actual embodied behavior. And so that would imply we wouldn't have AI systems that could understand until we have fully embodied robots. But, we're getting damn close to that, right? This is something we can also investigate. We have systems already that can transpose text into image. We're already androids, When you're on Twitter, you're an android. Well, why? Well, there are lots of trolls on Twitter. Sometimes I'm one of them, by the way. He's already a human-machine hybrid, and he's a human super-intelligent connected machine hybrid. And so that means all his pathology is multiplied immensely by our technological might. And I've thought recently that virtualization enables psychopathy. So in normal social situations, if you're a narcissistic Machiavellian and you push it too hard, someone will absolutely hit you. And that will be the end of it. Most of the time, it's cowards who take that route, and it doesn't take much intimidation to stop them. Just the hint of appropriate, just retaliation will keep them silent. Part of the reason that our culture is being torn apart at the moment is because virtualization enables psychopathy. That's a big problem. And so that all pertains to this question of, when you have bigger toys, you better be a bigger boy.
What's your position on artificial intelligence, potential positive and negative outcomes, and general sense of what it will mean?
Well, my position basically is we better get our act together before the giants show up. And they're like knocking at the door right now. So you better build your art. We're whipping up some things in the lab that will make everything that's come so far look like nothing's happened at all yet. And that's not like next year, that's tomorrow, that's now. So we're going to have a lot of things to contend with. And they're very promising. The only thing that's stopping that is time. Like, it's the possibility of doing that's right there. We're going to be able to build, we can already build incredibly intelligent systems. The tech is already in place. And so I have no idea what that's going to mean, and it could easily lead us astray. So here's something that's going to happen in the next year. So imagine now you're a lonesome guy and you can get a digital friend, woman. She can talk to you like ChatGPT talks to you and listen like ChatGPT listens to you, which is maybe, if you're really lonesome and alienated, more than anyone has ever listened to you in your life. And then soon, she'll not only listen to you as a text interface, but she'll be a fully rendered 3D, let's say 2D photorealistic, fully rendered animation, indistinguishable from a genuine image of a person, image of a genuine person, right? Is you'll be able to turn your virtual girlfriend into your virtual sex partner, and who knows what that'll do, right? And then the next thing after that is you'll be able to put that into a robot. And that's just one thing that's going to happen, maybe not even the most surreal thing. You know, pretty soon we'll be contending with the fact that someone will be able to generate a photorealistic version of Donald Trump and have him say something absolutely reprehensible and spread it everywhere just before election night. And there'll be real confusion about whether he said it or didn't. So what do we do when our representations of reality can be falsified? The bigger the toy, the smarter you better be to use it. So that's worth thinking about, because we're coming up with some pretty damn big toys. And what did my friend Jonathan Pajot said again? He said recently, I told you about him, this deep, deep religious thinker. He's something. He said, we're going to see giants walk the earth again. And you think, well, what does that mean? It's technology is moving so quickly that even those who are on top of it can't keep up. So, and I would say we better get our act together, because we could make this world quite the heavenly place, but there's a lot more pathways to hell than there are to heaven. You know, by the time World War II hit, we were pretty damn technologically powerful. We could take out a lot of the world in a very short period of time, but that was nothing compared to what we can do now. So we're really at a crossroads. We could have everything we could dream of if we were careful, but we could have a nightmare beyond contemplation if we're not. And so I would say, also, as we become technologically more powerful, every single individual becomes more powerful. And that means the corruption of the individual starts to become more and more a world destabilizing force. You should know this. There are things coming down the pipeline on the artificial intelligence front that are just going to make your hair stand on end within the next year, because there is so much transformation going on in that domain. And that's been the case particularly for the last 6 months, that it's almost unimaginable. You're going to see things you just can't possibly. How many of you clap? How many of you know what ChatGPT is? Okay. So not very many. So I'll tell you what ChatGPT is, just so you know, because you need to know this. And I don't know what sort of technological revolution this is. Gutenberg press level. I went and interacted with it. It's an AI system, artificial intelligence system. It basically is trained on, well, a massive corpus of spoken or of text. So it's derived its models of the world from the analysis of human speech, essentially. It isn't using real world data yet, but that will be happening. Okay, so now we have an AI model that can extract a model of the world from the entire corpus of language. All right, and it's smarter than you, and it's going to be a hell of a lot smarter than you in 2 years. So you can get ready for that too. You know, you hear babies have no theory of mind. It's like, yeah, no, they can imitate. That's pretty bloody amazing, man. Like, you haven't seen robots that can do that yet. Although there are robots now that you can teach by moving their arms. You move their arms, and then they'll do it. And so you can actually program them by moving them, and then they'll just repeat it. And so they're getting damn close to imitation, because they're going to be imitating each other as well as us. And they're going to do it so fast, you just won't be able to believe it. So that's coming. The organism adapts itself by materially constructing new forms to fit themselves into those of the universe, whereas intelligence extends this creation by constructing mental structures which can be applied to those of the environment. You know, the guys that are building the autonomous cars, like, they don't think they're building autonomous cars. They know perfectly well what they're doing. They're building fleets of mutually intercommunicating autonomous robots, and each of them will be able to teach the other, because their nervous system will be the same. And when there's 10 million of them, when one of them learns something, all 10 million of them will learn it at the same time. So they're not going to have to be very bright before they're very, very, very smart. Because us, you know, we'll learn something, you have to imitate it. It's like, God, that's hard. Or I have to explain it to you, and you have to understand it, and then you have to act it out. We're not connected wirelessly with the same platform. But robots, they are. And so once those things get a little bit smart, they're not going to stop at a little bit smart for very long. They're going to be unbelievably smart. And they're imitating the hell out of us right now, too, because we're teaching them how to understand us. Every second of every day, the net is learning what we're like. It's watching us, it's communicating with us, it's imitating us, and it's going to know, it already knows in some ways more about us than we know about ourselves. When people were first developing models of artificial intelligence, they thought they'd be able to develop machines that sort of modeled the world, and then figured out how to act in the world, sort of abstractly, and then after they figured out how to act in the world, would then act in the world. But that proved to be impossible, as you can tell, because we don't have them. And so some robotics engineers, such as Rodney Brooks, who worked at MIT, started building robots from the bottom up. He made these little mindless robots that really didn't even have a central processor that were action-oriented. So like the first things he built were these little insect-like things that could skitter away from light. That's all they could do. Turn on light, poof, they'd go find some dark. And it's as if, so imagine the world to that robot was a binary place. It was either a light place or a dark place. And then you might say, well, what did light or dark mean to this little robot?
And then you have to ask yourself, well, what does meaning mean? And that's a very good question. It's one that Piaget answers. Meaning means, to that little robot, move to a different place. So light to that robot meant move to a different place. So what the robot, in a sense, was doing was transforming one form of information, light versus dark, into another form. Well, some of you have seen Big Dog. You've seen Big Dog? Look up DARPA, D-A-R-P-A. How many of you have seen Big Dog? How many of you are terrified by Big Dog? Yes. Big Dog is this robot that's being developed by the U.S. Army that is about this big, and it's four-legged. It's got a head. And it can run like faster than you. And it can run in snow, and it can run on ice, and it can run up hills. And if you kick it, it balances and stands back up. And hypothetically, it's going to be used to transport like the heavy things that soldiers have to carry. But, don't believe that. That's a stupid idea. Once these things can ambulate by themselves, and they can already follow each other because now they have visual systems, arming them is going to be a very simple matter. And so the probability that we'll have unbelievably super fast robots that can shoot you in 10 years is, like, to me, as far as I can tell from the development, is absolutely certain. When the robots shoot at you, not only will they shoot at where you are, but they'll shoot at the 6 places that they calculate you're most likely to dart to, and they will never miss. So that's a lovely thing to think about.
I don't think it's within the scope of anyone's vision to predict even what's likely to happen over the next 40 years, because the rate of technological advance is so insane that, in some sense, all bets are off. And I really mean that. I have a variety of contacts in Silicon Valley, and there are people there that I've been communicating with who believe that it's already within their power to build an AI machine that will have higher computational capacity than the human brain. That's within 5 years. Now, that assumes that they've got the computational capacity of the brain properly calculated, and that's not necessarily the case. But even if they're out by a factor of 10, that's not many iterations past that. Now, maybe we don't understand the brain at all. That's certainly possible. But it isn't just the rapid increase in computational power that's doubling so quickly. I don't know if how many of you watch the Boston Dynamics videos? So how many of you don't know what I'm talking about? Okay, so one of the things I would highly recommend is that you go home and go to YouTube and look up Boston Dynamics, because it's the most advanced robotics company in the world, and it was a DARPA project, so an American defense company, and they were bought by Google 5 years ago, and they had pretty damn impressive robots 5 years ago. They were autonomous, and they could make their way over rough terrain, including snow, up hills. If they slipped on the ice, they could right themselves. If you pushed them over, they could put themselves back up. And that's not joystick controlled. That was all autonomous. And they ran on gasoline-powered motors and were capable of autonomous action for an hour and a half or so. And I looked at the last iteration, and it's a small robot about this big, and it has a hand that looks like a head. And it's so sophisticated that it can gyrate to music spontaneously, and it can keep its head in the same place. And, there's something very strange about robots that people don't generally think about. Some people do. Imagine you have a robot, and it can learn a few things through imitation. And we already have robots that can do that, because you can program a robot, industrial robot that's worth about $20,000. You can move its arm the way you want it to move its arm, and then it will move its arm that way. So imitation is coming up very rapidly, and the capacity to autonomously learn is already there to some degree. Let's say you have a robot that can learn a little bit, not much, but then let's say you have 20 million of them, and they're all exactly the same, and they have exactly the same architecture. And so what that means, as soon as one robot learns something, then all 20 million of them learn it. And so if each robot is learning one thing a day, then the whole herd is learning 20 million things a day. And so once we hit a certain threshold, the rate of increase in robotic intelligence is going to be just something that we can't even comprehend. I talked to the people at Tesla who ran the autonomous car division, and they know perfectly well they weren't creating autonomous cars, because an autonomous car isn't a car, it's a robot. And it's not just a robot, it's a fleet of robots, and it's a fleet of intelligent robots. And some of the functions that it will perform will be the functions of a car. But to think about that as a car, you're just confused. It's like to think of a car as a horseless carriage. The person who ran the division told me that they'd already had plans instantiated so that all the Tesla cars map the roads, and they're mapping them at an increasingly high level of resolution, and then they share the data. And they expected to get to the point where the car would be able to predict where the bumps on the road were that it was approaching and adjust the suspension so that when you hit the bump, you wouldn't feel that at all, because the suspension would have mapped the bump before it encountered it. It's an example of how unbelievably quickly this technology is progressing. So now, what are we going to do about that? Well, I'm hoping that we're going to be smart enough as individuals, and careful enough and ethical enough and fast, as we continue to produce increasingly intelligent computers and robots that are going to mimic us, that they mimic something good enough so that it doesn't destroy us. And so a lot of that's going to depend on the ethical integrity of the people who are working on these advanced systems. Hopefully we'll be wise enough to manage it with a certain degree of wisdom. We better. And that's another thing, I guess I can close the answer to that, is that, we're entering an era of exponential transformation. And I would say a lot of the evidence suggests that that's a good thing. So I would say on balance, the world is much better than it was 50 years ago. Every visual scene is incomprehensibly complex. There's an indefinite number of ways of seeing everything. And this is partly why we don't have general purpose robots, is because AI engineers originally believed that the problem of robotics would be the computation of action in the world. But it turned out that the problem of robotics was seeing the world. And that really shocked everyone. You could get lost in the details of this carpet. If you were a photorealist painter, you could take just a section of the carpet and it would take you maybe 3 weeks to paint it in a high resolution manner. And even then you wouldn't have captured anywhere near the detail and you'd only have done it under one condition of illumination. And that's just a fragment of a visual scene. I think that we're in a time of unparalleled possibility. So for good and for evil. And that the more people that there are out there who have their acts together, the better the probability that we're going to be able to manage it. Because we've all got some pretty hard decisions to make coming up real fast. And these guys that are working on these AI systems, I'm hoping that the ones that are more ethically oriented in a proper direction will be the ones that have the upper hand. They're very promising. I was talking to my brother-in-law, for example, who's the world's greatest chip designer, as it turns out, and he's built. I don't know if there's anybody who's changed the world more in the last 15 years than Jim, with the possible exception of Musk. And that'd be a tight battle, because he built all the chips in your iPhone and in Intel systems and in AMD systems. And one of the things we were talking about last week was the possibility that we could build a ChatGPT system, essentially, that was a trained neuroscientist. And so I thought I could work with him to identify the cardinal works of neuroscience over the last 15 years, the greatest books, the greatest papers, train the ChatGPT system on that, and then use it as a scientist to evaluate the current literature. And that seems like the only thing that's stopping that is time. And ChatGPT has its problems and its biases, but Jim figures we'll figure out how to. See, right now, ChatGPT only uses language. So to the degree it's intelligent because of the intelligence that's encoded only in language. And if the linguistic corpus, so the body of text that we've all produced, is biased and warped in some way, that'll be built into the ChatGPT system. And along with whatever biases the programmers might have purposely or inadvertently put into the system. But Jim figures that the AI systems will be able to calibrate their linguistic knowledge against knowledge of images in the world soon. And that's basically what scientists do, right? Because scientists will take a verbal hypothesis and then test it against the actual world. And if the hypothesis and the world fit, then you think, well, that's scientifically verified. And Keller thinks that AI systems will be able to do that pretty soon. And pretty soon means as soon as someone builds one that can do it. The robots have been tricky, but I can't imagine that's more than 10 years away. And that's just one thing that's going to happen, maybe not even the most surreal thing. Pretty soon we'll be contending with the fact that now, I was talking to my son about that today, and he thinks we'll get into an arms race right away because there'll be technologies that can detect whether video is artificial. But then, there'll be a race because other technologies will learn how to fool that technology. And, maybe we'll be able to stay on the edge where we can still detect what's real and what isn't. But I don't think we're doing a very good job of that right now on social media, because social media, it's kind of like the world, except it's way more demented. And the problem with that is that it makes the whole world look demented. And that's a real possibility. Or it'll be a tomorrow that will make all the hells we've managed to generate in the past look like Satan was just warming up. And we're toying with that right now in an unbelievably provocative manner. On the AI front, we can all get our act together fast enough. Because I also think that we've got this choice in front of us right now, as far as I can tell. And that's, we can either play out the apocalypse spiritually, that means conceptually, and sort ourselves out ethically and separate the wheat from the chaff within each of us, or the saved from the damned, or, as Jung said, Carl, you play it out in the world as fate. And I'm utterly convinced that that's true. You think we're powerful now, man. You wait till the AI giant starts to stroll around the earth, and that's coming. Like, you will absolutely see that in your lifetime. You'll probably see it in the next 2 or 3 years. Intelligence extends this creation by constructing mental structures which can be applied to those of the environment. That's the Darwinian idea that I just mentioned. They're going to be unbelievably smart, like overnight. And they're imitating the hell out of us right now, too, because we're teaching them how to understand us. Every second of every day, the net is learning what we're like. It's watching us, it's communicating with us, it's imitating us, and it's going to know, it already knows in some ways more about us than we know about ourselves. There's lots of reports already of people getting pregnancy ads or ads for infants.
sometimes before they know they're pregnant, but often before they've told their families. And the way that happens is the net is watching what they're looking at and inferring with its artificial intelligence.
There's a human side of the equation. And you get the extreme thing, people, and you think, yeah, well, what about the human here? And when we've been talking about the necessity of having a technological enterprise embedded in an ethic, and you can ignore that, like most of the time, right? You can ignore the overall ethic in some sense when you're toying around with your toys. But when you're building artificial intelligence, it's like, well, that's not a toy. And this is a whole new